Reflecting on the legacy of Sly Stone brought up a number of questions. When looking at some of the depictions of Sylvester Stewart over time, some of the depictions really stand out in terms of phenotype and also in terms of dress, and so in terms of the choice of clothing. And so, what we're going to be doing is delving back into the Indian slave ship discussion. We had a discussion earlier about trading places and these Indian slave ships that were named Indian Queen, Indian King, Indian Prince, and then in one instance, Indians. Now, what has come up with reflecting on Sly Stone is a notation related to his phenotype. His phenotype is very similar to other entities that identify as American Indian. And so there are some questions about ancestry, particularly when he has a name like Stewart as a surname, but also there appears to be a Habsburg jaw dynamic going on, and then also these features that look like they are very similar to individuals who identify as American Indian. Now, he has an ancestry that traces back to Texas. I'm not sure about the rest of his ancestry, but a number of questions have come up, particularly related to the slave trade that was the intra-American slave trade, and so that moving people around in the Americas. And what has been noted is that there were entities identified as Indian in these deportation slave ships, and so they appear to be simply slave ships. However, some of the people are identified specifically as Indian, and we're going to look at a few depictions of Sly Stone, and then we're going to look at some of the data related to people who were moved around the Americas who were identified as Indian. And so this is part 2 of our discussion. The other discussion will be linked below so that you can check that out also, and then look at this in that context. And here you can see manifestations of the Habsburg jaw when Sly was a little boy. And here you can see, along with the very interesting outfit, you see the manifestations of the Habsburg jaw. You see it in the side pictures, and then you also see some manifestations in the center depiction. Notably, there are a number of shared dynamics and shared phenotypes related to people in different geographic spaces. And so with respect to the Caribbean, there are some similarities that are noted with respect to Jamaica and Barbados. And then also you see some similarities with people in the southeastern region. And so when you look at Sly, you can see some similarities between Sly in terms of this phenotype and some other individuals who are from different parts of the Caribbean. And this outfit specifically resembles an American Indian inspired type of clothing. In terms of the identifiers for enslaved people, there were 0 people identified as American Indian on these transatlantic voyages. And so it was checked going in multiple directions, and there was a total of 0. However, when checking in the intra-American records, what we find is specifically a record of slave ships with people identified as Indian on the slave ships. So when we look at the information for the intra-American slave trade that involved Indians, we see that there were 34 voyages, and these voyages started in 1607. And then the next one was 1616, followed by a sort of pickup 1635, and then a couple of ships in 1636. And then it continues on. What you might also notice is that the earlier voyages were related to the Spanish slave trade, and then it grows to include other entities. But what you also might notice is that with respect to the numbers, in many instances, the number of Indians transported is not provided. And so, therefore, we don't have a complete picture of exactly how many people were being transported. And I want to be clear about this. If they are American Indians and they are being moved from one place in the Americas to another place in the Americas, this is also a form of removal and deportation. And when looking at the dynamics on the west coast of Africa, um, many of those situations also appear to be deportations and removals. And we can get into that at another time. But right now, we are just looking at the Indians in the intra-American slave trade. And so you see ultimately when it starts to bring in a different collective. So not just the Spanish trade, but the British trade specifically. So you see that in 1616, but you also see the manifestation of it in 1686, coming out of the Bahamas, transporting people into Jamaica. And here you have people identified as Indian being captured in Jamaica, transported to New York. And then you see several coming out of South Carolina from 1711 down to 1711. This continues on here. So South Carolina to Upper James River. And so you see multiple dynamics going on here. And so all you have to do with respect to this is figure out which American Indian tribes, clans, nations were in South Carolina, and then where they were going in terms of this Upper James River. And so there's clearly this deportation of American Indians from one part of the South to another part of the South. Now, it's unclear at this point if they were being moved to a completely different location in terms of American Indian nations. That's not clear because they are not specifying which nations they were taking people from and which nations they were moving people to. And so, generally speaking, the land belonged to the Indians. And so, whatever area they went from and went to, it's American Indian territory. Then you also see 1711 coming out of Port Royal going into Boston. And here in 1712, you see again coming out of South Carolina and deporting people to Upper James River. Another Indian deportation coming from South Carolina to Upper James River in 1713. And then the involvement of North Carolina. So in 1714, there was deportation from North Carolina to York River, and then North Carolina to Upper James River. And then back again in 1715, South Carolina to Upper James River. Then there is another type of slave trade going on here with 1715 Jamaica to New York. And so there was the deportation of Indians out of Jamaica into New York. 1715 deportation of Indians out of Philadelphia into Jamaica. Again, some of these numbers may or may not be correct, and in some instances there is no provision of numbers, but you know at least one entity identified as an Indian has been transported on these specific ships. Continuing on, we have Indians enslaved in South Carolina transported to Upper James River again. This is 1716. Then deported from South Carolina to New York. Another South Carolina to New York. 1718, South Carolina to Upper James River. South Carolina to Lower James River. And then another transport involving Jamaica. So 1723, a transport of Indians from Jamaica to New York. And then in 1725, coming out of Martinique to Curacao. And that's 1725. And then Indians enslaved in 1726, going from South Carolina to New York. Continuing on, we have in 1728 a deportation transport from Barbados to New York of Indians. Then we have in 1728 another Indian transport coming out of Jamaica to New York. And then 1731 and 1733, there are transports coming out of Suriname to New York. And I want to point out that these are just the numbers that they are making available. Clearly, this was a process that was going on, and there was a significant Indian slave trade going on. And so there were these processes that involved deportation and removal of American Indians and transplanting them in different parts of the Americas. And finally, it was noted that Sly Stone's birthplace is Denton, Texas. His mother's birthplace is reported as Denton, Texas. And within that particular area, there were historically 4 primary tribes that I've been able to identify: Wichita, Caddo, Comanche, and Cherokee. While we see that Denton, Texas was the home to multiple Indian nations, including the Wichita, the Comanche, the Cherokee, the Caddo, what we also note is that the first enslaved people did not come to Denton until the 1840s with an entity known as the Peters Colony. It would certainly be interesting to find out a little bit more about the relationship between the enslaved individuals in Denton, Texas, and the Indian tribes or nations.